There is a moment that comes for almost everyone, usually somewhere past 60, when the world goes quiet for just a second, and a single thought rises up from underneath everything else. Is this it? Is this what the rest of my life is going to feel like? The body has changed. The mirror shows someone your parents used to be. The children have their own children now. The job that once defined you is gone or fading, or something you're counting down toward. And in that silence, a question that no one warned you about starts to whisper. Not what's next, but what was the point? Here is what almost nobody tells you. That question is not a curse. It is an invitation. And 2,000 years ago, a small group of philosophers in Rome and Greece already answered it, in letters written to dying friends, in journals never meant to be published, in speeches given by men who had lost everything and found something better on the other side. They called their philosophy Stoicism, and it was built, quite literally, for this exact moment in a human life. Not for the young and ambitious, not for the busy and distracted, for the ones who have already lived enough to know that comfort was never the answer, and are ready to hear what actually is. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why so many people spend their 60s, 70s, and 80s either quietly afraid or quietly furious, and the specific, practical shift in thinking that the Stoics discovered, which turns those same decades into the calmest, freest, most genuinely happy years a person can live. Stay with me, because the third section of this video contains a single idea from Marcus Aurelius's private journal that has changed how thousands of people in our community think about the years they have left. And it might be the most important 5 minutes you spend all week. Welcome to Wisdom of the Stoics, the home for anyone who has ever wanted to feel a little steadier in a world that rarely slows down. Here we take the oldest, most tested ideas about how to live from Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who ruled the known world and still found time to write himself notes on how to be a better man. From Seneca, the advisor who lost his fortune, his freedom, and nearly his life, and still taught calm to others. And from Epictetus, who began life enslaved and ended it as one of history's great teachers of freedom. And we translate their wisdom into something you can actually use today. If you're new here, consider this your invitation to sit down, breathe, and remember that peace of mind was never something you had to chase. It was something you had to uncover. Let's begin. Somewhere along the way, most of us absorbed a story about aging that we never actually chose. It came from advertisements that only show wrinkles being erased. It came from workplaces that quietly stop inviting you to certain meetings once you pass a certain age. It came from a culture that treats 60, 70, and 80 as a slow exit from relevance, rather than an arrival into something. And because we absorbed that story without ever examining it, most people walk into their later decades already grieving a version of themselves that youth culture told them was the only version worth being. Think about your own life for a moment. Think about someone you know, a parent, a grandparent, maybe yourself, who reached 65 and suddenly seemed to shrink. Not physically, something quieter than that. They stopped starting new things. They talked more about the past than the future. They apologized for taking up space at family gatherings as though their opinions had expired along with their job title. Nobody did that to them directly. They did it to themselves because they had unconsciously accepted a script that said, this chapter is decline, not growth. The Stoics would have found this tragic and frankly a little embarrassing for us. Not because aging isn't real. They knew better than anyone that the body fails, that friends die, that strength fades. But because they built an entire philosophy around a radical, almost rebellious idea that a human being's worth, happiness, and dignity have nothing to do with what the body can still do, and everything to do with what the mind chooses to do with what remains. Epictetus, who himself walked with a permanent limp from an injury he received as a slave, used to teach his students that the body is not truly yours in the way you think. It is on loan. It was always going to change, fade, and eventually be returned. What is actually yours? what can never be taken by time, illness or circumstance, is your capacity to judge, to choose, to respond. And that capacity does not weaken with age. If anything, it sharpens. So here is the first shift we need to make, right at the very beginning of this video. Before anything else can make sense, growing older is not a subtraction. It is a transfer of power. The power you used to place in your appearance, your physical strength, your job title, your ability to keep up with a room full of 25-year-olds, that power gets returned to you, and it becomes available to place somewhere else entirely, somewhere the Stoics considered infinitely more valuable. Your judgment, your character, your ability to remain undisturbed while everyone else panics. That is not a lesser life. That, according to men who studied happiness more rigorously than almost anyone in history, is the beginning of the only kind of life actually worth having. If this idea already feels like it's loosening something in your chest, do me a favor and drop a comment below telling me how old you are right now, and what year you secretly hope people will remember as when things got better. For you, because I read every single one of these, and I promise you, this community is full of people exactly like you, quietly rebuilding their idea of what a good life looks like. Let's talk about time, because nothing haunts a person in their 60s quite like the sound of a clock they suddenly feel too loudly. Seneca, the Roman statesman and philosopher, wrote an entire essay on this subject called On the Shortness of Life, and the very first line is a gut punch that still lands 2,000 years later. He said that the majority of people complain about the cruelty of nature because we are born for so brief a span, and because even this small stretch of time rushes by so rapidly. But then he says something that should stop you cold. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. Life is long enough, he argues, if you know how to use it. Sit with that for a second, because it reframes the entire fear that so many people carry into their 60s and 70s. The fear that there simply isn't enough time left to matter. Seneca isn't offering false comfort here. He isn't telling you that you have all the time in the world. He is telling you something far more useful, that the anxious, distracted, comparison-driven version of a life wastes decades without even noticing, while a deliberate, present, undistracted version of a life can find more meaning in a single remaining decade than most people find in 80 years of sleepwalking. Picture two people, both turning 65 on the exact same day. The first person spends their days scrolling through news that upsets them, replaying arguments from years ago, resenting family members for things that can't be changed, and dreading a future they've already decided will be lonely and painful. The second person, with the exact same number of years left, the exact same body, the exact same bank account, spends their days present with the people in front of them, curious about one new thing each week, forgiving quickly and treating each ordinary Tuesday as something that will never happen again in quite the same way. Which one of these people, according to Seneca, actually lived longer? He would say the second person, not metaphorically, literally, because a life measured by attention and presence contains more actual living than a life measured merely by the number of mornings you wake up. This is why Seneca warns so sharply against what he calls preoccupatio. The state of being so busy, so mentally cluttered, so preoccupied with things outside your control that you are never actually inhabiting the moment you are in. He says most people don't live. They merely intend to live, always deferring real life to some future point that keeps sliding further away. And then one day they are old, and they realize with horror that the someday they were waiting for was actually every single day they already spent. This is the exact trap that catches so many people in their 50s and 60s. They spent their entire working life saying, once I retire, then I'll really start living. And then retirement arrives, and the habits of distraction and postponement don't disappear just because the calendar changed. The Stoic answer isn't to panic about lost time. Panic is just another form of wasting the present moment, this time by worrying about the past. The Stoic answer is to start today, in this exact hour, treating your attention as the most valuable currency you own, because unlike money, you cannot save it for later. You can only spend it now or lose it forever. I want you to try something with me right now while you're watching this. Think of one thing, just one, that you have been postponing under the story of someday, a conversation you've meant to have, a trip you've meant to take, a hobby from your 20s you quietly gave up on. Write it in the comments, not to perform it publicly, but because naming a thing out loud is the first step the Stoics recommend toward actually choosing it instead of merely wishing for it. I want to tell you a story now because ideas are easier to carry when they have a face attached to them. And this particular face belonged to a man named Cato, specifically Cato the Younger, one of the most quietly ferocious Stoics in Roman history. By the time Cato reached his final years, Rome had changed underneath him in almost every way he had spent his life. Fighting against, he had watched the republic he loved slowly collapse into the hands of ambitious men chasing personal power, first Pompey, then eventually Julius Caesar, a man Cato considered an existential threat to everything Rome was supposed to stand for. Cato was not young. He did not have unlimited energy. He did not have the machinery of empire behind him. What he had was a mind that refused to be bent by circumstances, no matter how overwhelming they became. When Caesar's forces finally closed in on the last resistance in North Africa, Cato found himself in the city of Utica, surrounded, outnumbered, with every practical exit sealed off except one: surrender to Caesar and live the rest of his life at the mercy of a man whose entire political existence Cato considered corrosive to everything good. Cato's friends begged him to negotiate. Surely, they said, an old man could be forgiven a peaceful retirement. Surely there was no shame in survival. But Cato understood something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. There is a difference between staying alive and staying yourself. He famously spent his final night reading Plato's dialogue on the immortality of the soul, not out of despair, but out of preparation, the same way a craftsman checks his tools before the final job. And when the moment came, he chose, with total calm, to remain the man he had always been rather than become a smaller, safer version of himself under someone else's terms. Now, I want to be very clear about something, because this is a video about happiness in your 60s and beyond, not a video about tragedy. I am not telling you this story to suggest that growing older means some dramatic final stand. Almost none of us will ever face a moment like Cato's. I'm telling you this story because of what it reveals about the entire architecture of Stoic thought. That the years near the end of a life are not a time to shrink your standards, soften your character, or quietly accept whatever version of yourself circumstances hand you. They are, if anything, the proving ground for everything you spent your earlier decades practicing. Cato wasn't performing courage for an audience in that final year. He had spent 40 years training his judgment, his discipline, his relationship to fear, precisely so that when the real test came, there was no gap between what he believed and what he actually did. That is the entire Stoic promise, and it applies just as much to a 70-year-old deciding whether to finally set a boundary with a difficult adult child, as it does to a Roman senator facing an army. The question is never, how much time do I have left? The question is always, who am I, choosing to be with the time I have? If you've ever had a moment in your later years where you finally said the thing you'd swallowed for decades, finally stopped shrinking to keep the peace, finally chose being yourself over being comfortable, I would love to hear about it in the comments. These stories matter more than you know, both to me and to everyone else watching who needs to hear that it's not too late to become that person too. Let's now get very practical, because at some point in this video, you deserve more than stories. You deserve a tool you can use starting today. Epictetus built the entire foundation of Stoic practice on a single distinction, one so simple it sounds almost too obvious. And yet almost nobody actually lives by it. He called it the dichotomy of control. Some things are up to us, he said, our judgments. our desires, our choices, our reactions. And some things are not up to us. Our bodies, our reputations, our health, the actions of other people, the outcomes of events. Nearly all human suffering, he argued, comes from confusing these two categories, treating things that are not up to us as though they were, and therefore building our peace of mind on a foundation that was never stable to begin with. Now apply this directly to your 60s, 70s, and 80s, because this is precisely where the dichotomy of control becomes not just philosophy, but survival. Your knees are not up to you anymore in the way they once were. Your hearing, your eyesight, the speed at which you recover from a long day, these are shifting according to biology, not according to your effort or your virtue. If you build your happiness on the expectation that your body should behave the way it did at 35, you have guaranteed yourself decades of quiet grief, because you are demanding control over something that was never fully yours to control in the first place, at any age. This is precisely the trap Epictetus warned against, mistaking the not up to us for the up to us, and then suffering endlessly over a battle you were never going to win. But here is the liberating flip side, the part people miss because they're so busy mourning the first half of the equation. What remains completely, entirely, unshakably up to you, at 60, at 75, at 90, is how you interpret what is happening to your body. Whether you meet a diagnosis with dignity or despair, whether you meet a slower morning with gratitude for the morning you still get, or resentment for the morning you used to have, whether you let a bad knee cancel your joy for the walk, or whether you find a way to still take the walk, slower, and discover that slower has its own quiet pleasures you were too fast to notice before. I think of an example that a woman in this very community once shared with me, a woman in her early 70s who had been an avid hiker her entire adult life. A hip injury meant the mountain. Trails she loved were no longer available to her the way they once were. By every conventional measure, this was a loss, and she felt it as one, deeply, for a period of real grief that the Stoics would never ask her to skip or fake her way through. Stoicism, contrary to popular myth, was never about suppressing real feeling. It was about not adding a second layer of suffering on top of the first by demanding reality be different than it is. What she discovered months later was that the mountains hadn't been the actual source of her joy. The source had been attention, noticing light on leaves, the rhythm of breath, the quiet company of her own thoughts. And it turned out those things were fully available on a flat garden path 15 minutes from her house. Nothing about her circumstances up to her had changed for the better. What changed was where she placed her judgment, and that single shift returned her joy to her almost completely intact. This is the practice I want to leave you with in this section, and I want you to actually try it, not just nod along. Tonight, take out a piece of paper, or open a note on your phone and draw a simple line down the middle. On one side, write down everything about aging that genuinely frightens or frustrates. You write now, health changes, energy changes, whatever it is. On the other side, next to each one, write down the one thing that remains entirely up to you in how you respond to it. Not a fix, not a solution, just your judgment, your interpretation, your choice of attitude. This single exercise, practiced by Stoics for 2,000 years, is one of the fastest ways to feel your footing return underneath you. And if this video is helping you feel that footing return even a little, this is exactly the moment I'd ask you to hit that like button, not for me, but because it tells YouTube to show this video to someone else out there, right now, quietly panicking about turning 65, who needs to hear exactly this. There is a phrase that later thinkers, particularly Nietzsche, borrowed and popularized from Stoic soil, and it captures something the Stoics circled, constantly without always naming it so cleanly. Amor fati, the love of one's fate, not mere acceptance, gritted through clenched teeth. Love, an active, chosen embrace of the life that actually happened to you, rather than a permanent quiet mourning for the life you imagined you'd have instead. This matters enormously in your 60s and beyond, because by this point in a life, almost everyone is carrying some version of the unlived life alongside the lived one. The career that didn't go the way you hoped, the marriage that ended, or the one that never began, the child who grew distant, the health that didn't hold up, the way you promised yourself it would if you just ate right and stayed active. Somewhere in the back of most people's minds, there is a ghost version of themselves, living the life that should have happened, and that ghost quietly haunts every ordinary Tuesday of the actual life still available to be lived. Marcus Aurelius, writing privately to himself in what we now call meditations, journal entries he never intended anyone else to read, which is exactly why they feel so startlingly honest, returns again and again to a single idea, that the obstacle is the way, that what stands in your path does not block the path. It becomes the path if you let it. He wasn't writing this from a place of comfort. He was writing it while ruling an empire during a plague, while burying children, while fighting wars he never wanted, at an age when most men would have already been considered old by Roman standards. And still, his private journal is not a document of bitterness. It is a document of a man actively practicing, entry after entry, the discipline of turning "this happened to me" into "this is what I have to work with now." This is Amor fati in its most practical form, and it is perhaps the single most important shift available to anyone entering their 60s and beyond. You are not being asked to pretend the losses didn't happen, or that they don't hurt. You are being asked to stop spending your remaining years locked in a losing argument with a past that cannot be changed, and instead turn your full attention toward the only thing that has ever actually been available to any human being at any point in history, this present circumstance exactly as it is right now, and what can be built from here. Think about grandparents who resent that their grandchildren live far away and rarely call, spending every visit subtly guilting the people in front of them for not being the family they imagined, versus grandparents who fully inhabit the 2 video calls a month they do get, who make those 20 minutes so warm and so unburdened by resentment that the grandchildren actually want to call more. The circumstances on paper might be identical. The internal experience and often the eventual outcome could not be more different. One version of that grandparent is loving a fate that doesn't exist. The other is loving the fate that does. I want to be honest with you here, because this channel has never been interested in cheap positivity. This is hard. Loving your actual fate instead of grieving your imagined one is one of the hardest psychological disciplines a human being can undertake, and the Stoics never pretended otherwise. Marcus Aurelius needed to write the same reminders to himself over and over, which tells you plainly that even an emperor who had access to every philosopher in the ancient world did not master this once and move on. He practiced it daily, like a muscle, because it required daily maintenance. That is actually good news for you. It means you are not failing by needing to return to this idea again and again. You are doing exactly what every Stoic before you also had to do. One of the quiet fears that sits underneath so many conversations about aging is the fear of being alone. Friends pass away, spouses pass away, children build their own lives in other cities, and there is a real, legitimate grief in watching your social world contract as the decades pass. A grief the Stoics never asked anyone to deny. But there is an important distinction the Stoics drew that our modern culture has almost completely lost, and it might be one of the most useful ideas in this entire video. The difference between solitude and loneliness. Loneliness is a form of suffering, rooted in a feeling of lack and the sense that something essential is missing, that you have been abandoned by a world that has moved on without you. Solitude, on the other hand, is simply the state of being physically alone, and it can be either agonizing or genuinely restorative, depending entirely on the relationship you have built with your own mind. Epictetus taught his students, many of whom were young men anxious about status and connection, that a person who cannot bear to be alone with their own thoughts has revealed something important. Not that solitude is dangerous, but that they have not yet done the work of building a mind worth spending time with. This sounds harsh at first, but it is actually one of the most hopeful ideas in all of Stoic philosophy, because it means the antidote to the fear of being alone in your later years is not endless external company. It is the deliberate, patient work of becoming someone whose own company you actually enjoy. This is why so many people in their 60s and 70s who seem to have the least going on externally, fewer visitors, fewer obligations, quieter homes, are sometimes among the most contented people you will ever meet, while others, surrounded by constant family activity, remain restless and dissatisfied. The difference almost never comes down to how many people are physically present. It comes down to whether a lifetime of avoiding one's own thoughts has left a person with an internal world that feels safe to sit in, or one that feels unbearable the moment the noise stops. If you are watching this, and solitude currently feels closer to loneliness than to peace, I want to offer you something concrete, not just comforting. Start small. 10 minutes a day, no phone, no television, no task to complete, just sitting and allowing whatever thoughts arise to simply be there without needing to fix, escape, or distract from them. This will likely feel uncomfortable at first. That discomfort is not a sign you're doing it wrong. It is a sign of exactly how unpracticed the skill has become. In a culture that has spent decades training all of us to fill every silence with a screen, like any skill, it strengthens with repetition. Seneca himself wrote to his friend Lucilius about the importance of learning to be a friend to yourself first, arguing that anyone who has not achieved this will find themselves dependent on constant company, not out of genuine love for others, but out of an inability to tolerate their own inner world. And here's the part that connects everything together. Once you no longer fear solitude, your relationships with other people actually improve, because you stop needing them to rescue you from yourself. You start choosing connection because you enjoy it, rather than clinging to it, because you're afraid of what happens when it's absent. That shift alone, from needing people to enjoying people, is one of the quiet, underappreciated gifts available specifically in the second half of life. Once you've done the work to make peace with your own company. If any part of this section is landing for you, subscribe to this channel now, because we go deeper into exactly these kinds of practices every single week. And this community has slowly become one of the most thoughtful, kind spaces on this entire platform for people genuinely trying to build a calmer relationship with the years ahead. We need to talk about the thing that almost every culture on Earth has taught us to avoid discussing directly, especially once we reach an age where it starts to feel less abstract. Death. The Stoics did something that sounds, on the surface, almost cruel until you understand what they were actually doing. They practiced what is now commonly called memento mori. Remember that you will die, not as a morbid obsession, but as one of the single most effective tools available for living fully. Marcus Aurelius reminds himself constantly throughout his private journal that he could leave this life right now, and he lets that fact govern how he acts, what he says, and how he treats the people in front of him. Seneca tells his friend Lucilius to count each day as an entire life in miniature, not because death is something to fear more intensely, but because a clear, honest relationship with mortality is precisely what strips away the small, petty distractions that otherwise consume most of a human life. Here is why this matters so specifically for you, right now in your 60s or beyond, more than it might matter to someone in their 20s. At 25, death feels theoretical, distant, almost fictional. By 60 or 70, it has stopped being theoretical. You have likely already lost people. You have felt your own body change in ways that quietly remind you of your own timeline. This means you are actually in a uniquely powerful position that younger people rarely have access to. You can no longer avoid the truth of memento mori through denial. The question is only whether you turn and face that truth with terror, or with the strange, hard-won clarity the Stoics insisted was available on the other side of it. Because here is what they discovered, and what modern research on end-of-life reflection has repeatedly confirmed since. People who develop an honest, unafraid relationship with their own mortality do not become depressed by it. They become astonishingly present. They stop postponing the phone call. They stop swallowing the apology they owe someone. They stop waiting for a better time to say the important thing. Because the entire premise of memento mori is that there may not be a better time, and that this recognition, rather than being frightening, becomes the very thing that makes today feel vivid instead of forgettable. I think of Seneca's own final act, recorded by the historian Tacitus. Condemned to death by the Emperor Nero, a former student who had turned on him, Seneca did not spend his final hours in panic. He spent them comforting the people around him, dictating final thoughts, and meeting the moment with the same composure he had spent his whole life teaching others to find. This was not a performance for history. It was the natural result of decades spent practicing the exact idea we're discussing right now, that death, faced honestly and early, loses its power to ambush you later. I want to offer you a gentler, more accessible version of this same practice, because most of us are not Roman Stoics facing execution. Simply this: once a week, take 5 quiet minutes and genuinely consider that this could be your final year. Not to spiral into fear, but to ask a simple, clarifying question. If this were true, what would I stop tolerating? What would I finally say? Who would I call? What small daily irritation would suddenly reveal itself as embarrassingly unimportant? People who practice this regularly report something consistent and remarkable. The fear of death, faced directly and repeatedly in small doses, becomes dramatically smaller than the fear of death, avoided and pushed into the corner of the mind, where it grows undisturbed and untested. This is, I think, the deepest secret hiding inside Stoic philosophy for anyone in the second half of life. The years ahead of you are not less valuable because there are fewer of them. They are more valuable precisely because their number is now visible in a way it never was in your 20s. Scarcity, faced honestly, is what gives anything its worth. The Stoics understood that your remaining years are not a shrinking, sad pile to be guarded anxiously. They are a finite, precious resource to be spent as deliberately and as fully as you are still capable of spending them. Everything we've discussed so far would remain merely interesting, rather than transformative, without some structure for actually living it. So let's close with the practical architecture, the daily habits that Stoic practitioners, ancient and modern, have used to turn philosophy into a felt experience, rather than an idea admired from a distance. The first habit is the morning premeditation, something Stoics called premeditatio malorum, or the premeditation of adversity. Each morning, before the day begins, take a few minutes to honestly consider what might go wrong. Not to catastrophize, but to rehearse. Perhaps a doctor's appointment brings difficult news. Perhaps a family member says something hurtful. Perhaps your body simply doesn't cooperate the way you hoped. By meeting these possibilities calmly in your imagination first, you rob them of their power to ambush you later. This single habit, practiced by Roman statesmen preparing for political betrayal, works just as effectively for a retiree preparing for an unpredictable day. The second habit is the evening review, a practice both Seneca and Epictetus insisted on, and one that Marcus Aurelius clearly used to structure much of his private journal. At the end of each day, ask yourself 3 honest questions. What did I do well today? Where did I fall short of the person I want to be? What can I do differently tomorrow? This is not an invitation to self-punishment. The Stoics were remarkably gentle with themselves in this practice, treating it more like an athlete reviewing footage than a judge issuing a sentence. Over months and years, this simple nightly habit builds something extraordinary, genuine self-knowledge, the kind that makes a person feel solid and known to themselves, which is precisely the feeling so many people in their later years quietly lack. The third habit is deliberate discomfort, something that sounds strange. applied to a body that already faces plenty of involuntary discomfort through aging, but bear with me. The Stoics occasionally practiced voluntary hardship, simpler meals, colder rooms, plainer clothes, not out of asceticism for its own sake, but to remind themselves that their happiness did not depend on comfort. For you, this might look like intentionally spending a day without the conveniences you normally lean on, or choosing the harder, more honest conversation instead of the easy, avoidant one. The goal is simply this: to prove to yourself again and again that your peace of mind does not live inside your circumstances. It lives inside your judgment, which travels with you no matter what circumstances arrive. The fourth and final habit is what I'd call active virtue, looking, each day, for one small opportunity to practice courage, justice, wisdom, or self-discipline, the four cardinal virtues the Stoics considered the entire foundation of a good life. This does not need to be dramatic. Courage might simply mean finally telling your adult child how you actually feel. Justice might mean speaking up for a neighbor being treated unfairly. Wisdom might mean pausing before reacting to something that would have once made you furious. Self-discipline might mean choosing the walk over the nap, even though the nap sounds better in the moment. These are not small things. According to the Stoics, these small daily choices are, quite literally, the entire substance of a well-lived life. There is no separate, grander stage where real virtue happens. This, right here, in your 60s, your 70s, your ordinary Tuesday, is the entire stage. I want to bring this all the way back to where we started. That quiet moment, somewhere past 60, when the world goes silent and a question rises up uninvited. Is this it? I hope, if you've stayed with me this far, that question no longer feels like a threat. I hope it feels closer to an invitation, the way the Stoics understood it 2,000 years ago. You are not approaching a decline. You are approaching the exact chapter of life. This entire philosophy was built for a chapter where the noise of ambition and comparison finally has room to quiet down, where your judgment has had decades to sharpen, where you have more actual freedom, not less, to decide who you are going to be with the time remaining. Your body will keep changing. That was never up to you at any age. But your character, your attention, your capacity to love, the life you actually have instead of grieving the one you imagined, that remains entirely, completely, unshakably yours for as long as you're here to use it. Cato chose to remain himself when everything around him said to become smaller. Seneca met his final hour with the same calm he spent a lifetime teaching. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire, still found time each night to ask honestly whether he had lived well that day. None of them had anything you don't already have access to right now. In this exact season of your life, the philosophy was never reserved for emperors. It was built patiently, letter by letter and journal entry by journal entry, for exactly the person watching this video right now. If this video gave you even a small measure of that steadiness, I want to ask you for 3 things, and I promise none of them will take more than a moment. First, if you haven't already, subscribe to Wisdom of the Stoics, because we build videos exactly like this one every single week, specifically for people who are done chasing noise and ready to build something calmer. Second, leave a comment telling me which single idea in this video you're going to actually practice this week. The dichotomy of control, the evening review, the honest 5 minutes with your own mortality, because naming it publicly, even here in a comment section, makes it far more likely you'll actually follow through. And third, if you know someone in their 60s or beyond who has seemed a little quieter lately, a little more uncertain about what's ahead, consider sending them this video. You might be handing them exactly the reframe they've been quietly waiting for, without even knowing how to ask for it. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Of everything you could have done with this half hour, you chose to sit with these ideas, and that alone tells me something good about the years you still have ahead of you. Until the next video, take care of your judgment, and the rest will follow. This has been Wisdom of the Stoics.